All right, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm really excited to share this space with you and for our conversation on why cash matters. My name's Emily Vyhnanek, and I'm the campaign manager for the Working Families Tax Credit Coalition. Before we begin today, I wanted to start by acknowledging that in Seattle, I'm on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish and the Coast Salish people, past and present. I want to honor with gratitude the land itself and also recognize that all of us across Washington and those of us who are joining outside of Washington are currently on traditional land of the Native and Indigenous people who still occupy it. Before we begin, I want to let you know what you can expect today. First, you'll hear from a national expert and thought leader, Mia Birdsong, who will lay important grounding in our conversation regarding why cash matters. Next, you'll hear from members of the Washington State Budget and Policy Center to look at the landscape of current cash policies in Washington, as well as new policies that must be prioritized in our state's recovery. And then finally, after both of those sections have concluded, we'll reach the Q&A section where we'll be taking questions directly from you. Additionally, some logistical notes that I'd like to share with you. We are in a webinar format today, so everyone joining us is muted. We highly encourage questions, and so if there are any questions that come up for you during the presentation, the best way to do that is by using the Q&A box. Closed captioning is also available, and you can enable it by using the clicking on the closed captioning button and then selecting show subtitle. I do want to express my gratitude for Mia for connecting us with Danae, who is graciously providing the live captioning during this webinar. And then finally, at the end of our presentation, on the call right now, there are partners that are working with us in coalition and advocating on the policies that we're talking about. And before the Q&A begins, we'll open up space if there's any words that they have to share or would like to share at that time. And I'll give more detailed instructions. All right, to set the stage for our conversation today, first and foremost, I'd like to warmly welcome Mia Birdsong. Mia is a pathfinder, community curator, and storyteller who steadily engages the leadership and wisdom of people experiencing injustice to chart new visions of American life. In her work on guaranteed income as senior fellow of the Economic Security Project, she taps into the voices and visions of low-income people to reimagine the American social contract. In addition to two powerful and widely viewed TED Talks, Mia recently came out with her new book, How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community, which is out now. Mia's work has also shaped in many ways our approach here at the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. And so please join me now in welcoming Mia.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you all for being here. Lately, though this is not new for me, I guess in the work that I do, I have been thinking a lot about the American dream, how it plays out in our personal lives and our policies, how it shows up in our healthcare, education, food, and housing systems, how it evolved and shifted and yet remained so aligned with its origins. The American dream is both an illusion and an aspiration. It is a false promise and real potential all wrapped up together. The founding fathers captured it by writing so powerfully about freedom and self-governance while inhabiting stolen land, enslaving people, and excluding most of the population from participating in that self-governance. But it remains an idea so compelling that we still celebrate its narratives. It tells us that in this nation, any individual with determination and hard work and a little talent can seize the opportunity that is waiting for them here to become successful. And we love stories that support this mythology, especially if they involve overcoming odds. It's the immigrant who got a job as a university janitor as a 16-year-old and became the university's president as an adult. It's the person who sent, their first book to 50 publishers before one said yes, and they became a best-selling author. Or the business mogul who kept losing money on various ventures before their big breakthrough made them millions. I am one of those success stories. I grew up in Rochester, New York, where I was raised by my mom. We were poor to working class when I was growing up. I was always aware that money was tight. I got a lot of my clothes from Goodwill. I got my first job at 13. From elementary school on, I was bused with a handful of other Black kids to a mostly white school in the suburbs. Like so many kids who were told that they benefited from affirmative action, I was instilled with this belief that my responsibility was to get an education, which would lead to a career, which was essential to the role I was meant to fulfill as a productive member of society and a credit to my race. So here I am. As an adult, I'm married, I have 2 children, I own my home, I have a retirement account. I definitely worked hard, but stories like mine about overcoming odds and individual triumph are a lie, and they're a dangerous one. They valorize the idea that an individual alone can make it, that you can be stronger than obstacles that for most of us include wide-reaching systems of race, gender, and class oppression. The heroes in those favorite success stories of ours are exceptional. And while exceptions can exemplify our aspirations, they should not be our standard. The fact that a full-time minimum wage job is not enough to get by on is not something people should have to overcome. The fact that public education in low-income neighborhoods is chronically underfunded is not something that our children should have to rise above. The fact that acquiring many of the drugs that many of us need to stay alive, like insulin, is increasingly out of financial reach is not something that anyone should have to solve for with a can-do attitude and a little grit. I've been doing some form of economic justice work for nearly 2 decades, and the folks that I partner with are working so hard and struggling so much to meet needs that none of us should ever have to worry about, certainly not in this wealthy nation. We can only do better when we recognize that the people who are struggling are not the problem, and we collectively need to make it easier. COVID has made it even more obvious that people are not poor because they don't work hard enough or don't save enough money or don't know how to create a budget. Look at all the essential workers who are literally keeping us alive while struggling to get by on minimum wage. We have poverty in this country because a handful of our fellow Americans hoard much more wealth than they need, more than many of them could spend in 100 lifetimes. Like, I literally did the math. Being a billionaire, you can't spend $1 billion. You really can't. In the research I've done with people who are poor, they're unwavering about what will fix this problem. We need to give them access to one of the most necessary tools in American life, cash. Cash allows you to pay for what you need and want when you need and want it. When we have the kind of agency inherently embedded in cash, we can make decisions based on what makes sense for our own lives. That kind of self-determination is what allows us to build our futures. In my research, as soon as I start talking to people about money, about what it feels like to not have it, and what would be different if they had just a little more, the conversations become about something more fundamental about our experience as humans. Money has a practical impact on our daily lives, but the sense of scarcity that so many people feel when it comes to money also affects our sense of well-being. Money, or the absence of it, can limit what you think is possible for your life, how you're able to spend time with your loved ones, where you're able to go, how you feel about yourself and who you can be. Money practically and psychologically impacts how much agency we have. We all want a good life, however we define that. And those of us in positions to determine who gets what have to interrogate what we think about who deserves a good life and who doesn't. Despite the founding fathers' intentions and exclusions, the pursuit of happiness idea is such a powerful one. My understanding of what Jefferson and company meant wasn't about joy or perpetual vacations or getting what you want. What they intended, and what resonates with me personally, is the idea of thriving and well-being. So if happiness is something that every one of us is entitled to at least try to achieve, then the current setup falls short. No one should have to be a superhero to get ahead. No one should have to be extraordinary to be afforded the things they need to live. No one should have to demonstrate that they are above average to be considered deserving. In the context of capitalism, the economic security that cash could provide would decrease the number of impossible choices too many people have to make, like the choice between paying rent or putting gas in your car to go to work. With more cash, you can make choices that move your life forward. Do you go back to school or do you start your own business? Do you work less and spend more time with your loved ones? How much do you save for retirement? How much for emergencies? With more cash, you can spend more time just being. That sort of agency and self-determination is more important than folks getting to a place of simple survival. I'm not interested in us settling for survival. I'm interested in more than that because that's what we were promised. That's the pursuit of happiness. That's what America could be, even though it was never meant to be that way for all of us. Moments like the one we're in right now have laid bare all of the false promise and failure of America. In that hard truth is clarity. And in that clarity is an opportunity to take big leaps toward rather simple ideas. Things like deservedness, prosperity, generosity, in love. If we want a just society, we have to address multiple inequalities, including the fact that some of us don't have enough because some of us have too much. Cornel West once said that justice is what love looks like in public. And I am inspired by a future in which our public policies and practices are expressions of love. And I'm excited to build a world in which each of us has our needs met, is cared for and loved so deeply that we give freely to others because we know we have more than enough. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Mia, for those powerful words. And, you know, the reminder of how important agency is, the myths that we hold on to, and the reminder that it is possible to do better and that we must do better if we are committed to justice. And just thank you for those really powerful words. I want to zoom in now and take a look at our state, Washington, and the people and the workers that are facing an increasingly difficult public health and economic crisis in this moment. Here in Washington, unemployment remains at historically high rates. Currently, and as we approach the fall, more and more Washingtonians are facing some of the highest rates of food insecurity that we've ever seen. And the resounding message that we've heard from community members, community partners, is just how critical flexible, direct, and low barrier cash assistance is in this moment. Federal action recently provided an initial payment to households in the form of a federal stimulus payment, but we know it's not enough. In households with low liquid savings, roughly half of that stimulus payment was spent within the first 10 days on essentials like groceries. And further, this federal action excluded millions of taxpayers who don't file with a Social Security number, but file with an individual taxpayer identification number, or ITIN. This includes many millions of undocumented workers who are seeing no relief at all. Today, we will look at the current landscape of cash policies in Washington, as well as new policies that must be prioritized in our state's recovery. Each of these policies work together to establish a continuum of cash support and illustrates various levels of how that support can look like, whether it's deeper, more targeted and ongoing, wider cash stimulus to reach a broader population of low and moderate income households, and policies that work to provide support to fill gaps created by federal action in order to achieve more equity in our state. To do this, now we'll turn to the members of the Washington State Budget and Policy Center who work to support these cash policies. I'm going to specifically turn it over to policy analysts Liz Olson and Margaret Babayan to share more.
Thank you so much, Emily. And a huge thank you to Mia for being with us today. That was such a powerful grounding. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this call. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here to lay some foundation and describe the cash assistance programs that currently exist in Washington State. I'll name those primary programs, describe some of their really significant structural issues, and map out what we here at the Budget and Policy Center see as important strategies to help push what currently exists into a more effective and more just policy infrastructure that truly meets the needs of our communities. So there are a handful of cash assistance programs in Washington that provide both ongoing income support as well as one-time payments. The most notable of these are the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or TANF, also called Work First here in Washington State, as well as the Aged, Blind, or Disabled Program, or ABD. Both of these provide monthly cash assistance to people living on very low incomes. TANF is specifically for families with children, and ABD is available to folks who are living with disabilities or are over 65. In the wake of COVID-19, some additional forms of direct cash assistance have become available as well, although on a temporary basis. So the Disaster Cash Assistance Program, or DCAP, was activated by the governor shortly after the emergency was declared, and it provides one-time emergency support to individuals and families who don't qualify for any other type of benefit. So here, I also want to be sure to mention the federal stimulus payments as well, right? And I think it's important to do so because I don't think that we should be thinking about that initiative as sort of over. There are about 230,000 people in Washington State who are estimated to not have received their stimulus check automatically. And so I think there's a role for state policymakers and advocates to play there in thinking about what kind of outreach our state should be doing to support folks to access that benefit that they're entitled to. So, you know, there really is no replacement for ongoing cash assistance, right? Mia laid out that income is just foundational to well-being and really our survival in our contemporary economy. And because of that, we really have an obligation to radically improve some of the programs that currently exist. So here I'm going to name some of the significant shortcomings. So most of our existing programs have just huge barriers to access, right? Onerous and invasive application processes, punitive work requirements, and time limits. And these are rooted really in anti-Black, white supremacist narratives about who is deserving of support and in a deep-seated distrust of people with low incomes. You know, in my own life, because of my class and racial privilege, when I've had a medical issue that put me out of work for a few months, I could rely on family support to help pay my rent, buy my groceries while I recovered. I didn't have to jump through the kinds of hoops that cash assistance applicants do in order to prove that I could be trusted with a small amount of resources or to show that I was trying to make it on my own. Another shortcoming really is exclusionary eligibility criteria. So undocumented immigrants in particular are systematically barred from nearly every form of state and federal assistance. One exception to that is the DCAP program, but undocumented community members have real concerns about how the application process for that support may expose them to issues around public charge. And, existing programs really just don't provide enough support for folks to actually live. And they're reaching a smaller and smaller slice of our population, even though there's persistent need. So how do we push back against those injustices, right? I'm going to offer just 3 strategies before I wrap up. First, as Mia's work really highlights, pursue change in partnership and center community expertise. And we at the Budget and Policy Center are thinking deeply about how we need to do this better in our work. And I want to recognize some of our partners that lead in this space, including some folks who are on the call today, the Statewide Poverty Action Network, Bird Bar Place in Seattle, MDC in Tacoma, and lots more. We really do our work in partnership and are grateful for the many leaders that we get to learn from in this space. 2, extend emergency changes. So I've mentioned DCAP, but in the wake of the COVID outbreak, administrative officials have made other emergency changes to cash benefits to make those programs less restrictive during the crisis, including things like suspending work requirements in Tanf, easing some of the certification processes in ABD. We should really be working to extend those changes for the duration of the economic downturn and work long-term to codify them in permanent policy change. And finally, decouple cash assistance from work and just increase benefits, right? A baseline level of support should not be conditional upon someone's ability to meet a work requirement. So as a final takeaway, there's some hard-won infrastructure for cash assistance that's already in place in our state, but existing programs are really falling short of the needs in our communities. And so that means that we not only need to strengthen what we currently have, but we also need to think beyond the existing systems. And so to help do some of that, I'm going to pass it back over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Liz, for that fabulous breakdown of what already exists. I am, just for all of your references, I'm going to step out of the moderator mode for a moment to understand and unpack a cash policy that can be truly a powerful and effective tool for direct cash payments, but is not yet a reality in Washington State. And I'm speaking specifically to the Working Families Tax Credit and the recently proposed recovery rebate. First, before anything else, I want to recognize the wonderful group of advocates that I am lucky to get the opportunity to work with every day that make up the Working Families Tax Credit Campaign and Coalition. This is a group of over 30 organizations who, over the past 2 years, 2+ years, have been committed to enacting a modern working families tax credit here in Washington State, which is our state's version of the federal earned income tax credit. To lay some context, it's important to know what the earned income tax credit is and why it's so effective. And essentially, the earned income tax credit is a refundable tax credit that is an effective and targeted way to put cash directly back in the pockets of working people. For many who receive this credit, this can mean a significant income boost during tax time, sometimes a quarter or even a third of someone's annual income coming all at once. And since the earned income tax credit was created, many states have gone ahead and enacted their own state equivalent. In Washington, that's what's known as the Working Families Tax Credit, but again, it's never been fully funded or implemented. And despite this, there is a clear need for direct cash payments in Washington State. At a baseline, the Working Families Tax Credit would start to directly offset some of the harm that's done by our regressive tax code. It is no secret that Washington State has the worst tax code in the nation, but it's necessary to remind us that the lowest income earners pay upwards of 18% of their annual incomes in state and local taxes here. Direct cash payments to those who are disproportionately paying most of their income in state and local taxes can provide essential relief to communities. And beyond the economic security that comes with a state EITC, like the Working Families Tax Credit, There are decades of research to support the long-term effects of the earned income tax credit. And I'm happy to talk with anyone offline all day about taxes. But I wanna elevate and highlight just a couple of things, which is first, there are demonstrated positive health impacts that come from the earned income tax credit. This can include increased positive infant and maternal health outcomes. And as recently as yesterday, a team of researchers led by Erin Morgan at the University of Washington released a study that found that increases in state EITCs are positively associated with significant reductions in frequent mental distress and poor physical health, especially during the months that the credit is received. And the other thing I want to highlight is that there are key learnings from the last recession that we really need to consider and let influence our path forward. The Working Families Tax Credit was actually passed into law as a 10% equivalent of the Earned Income Tax Credit back in 2008, but it was never fully funded. When looking at the Earned Income Tax Credit and the claims that followed the Great Recession, there's actually a bump in EITC claims in Washington state in the out years of the recession. And further, in years that were recognized as a recovery in Washington, where poverty rates decreased overall, deep poverty actually increased, specifically for Black populations. We now find ourselves facing a larger economic recession, and we have the opportunity to do things differently and address these deep inequities head on. Our coalition, as the COVID-19 crisis started to set in, our coalition came together and tried to take stock of what was happening, how it impacted the work that we're all doing, and the specific financial hardships that communities are facing in this moment. And as a result, we developed a policy proposal for an immediate state cash stimulus, which we'll call the Recovery Rebate, that leverages the framework of the Working Families Tax Credit to send out immediate cash payments to households who qualify for the EITC. And also for those households who qualify but don't receive the EITC because they don't file with a Social Security number or they file with an ITIN. This recovery rebate would provide an immediate relief to hundreds of thousands of Washington households and set the foundation and an on-ramp for permanent Working Families Tax Credit and permanent structural change that our coalition has proposed. I'll close by saying that our coalition remains deeply committed to this important advocacy because there is no question that cash matters, and we have the mechanisms to do this. We're committed to fully enacting and fully funding a recovery rebate and the Working Families Tax Credit. And with that, I want to now turn it over to policy analyst Margaret Babayan to share more.
Thanks so much, Emily. You know, as we talk about getting cash directly to people, we need to remember the 200,000 people across the state who are undocumented and barred from accessing federal and state supports. That's despite being really important parts of our community as a whole and besides contributing labor that's both paid and unpaid. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that Mia has actually talked about a lot in her work. I want to acknowledge my own family's luck in our immigration story and the privilege that I have because of it. My mom was actually 4 months pregnant with me when my parents immigrated to the US. And again, because of some luck in getting their application approved, and frankly, some racist immigration policy that could be a whole webinar of its own, my parents had access to financial supports and rental assistance that's given me a lot of privilege and really helped me get to where I am today. That same support has not been historically available to people who are undocumented. It's not really available today either. And it's not because my family worked any harder or is any more deserving of the aid. It's because of these really unjust systems. I'll also lift up that people have a way of taking care of one another in their own communities. I saw this growing up. My parents bringing food to other people bringing food to us, people crashing on couches when they were evicted and not able to pay rent. So really amazing stories of just communities coming together and helping one another. At the same time, it is unjust for people not to have access to public support or fear accessing government support because of the threats of public charge, threats of deportation, or family separation. At the start of this pandemic, people in the undocumented community really came together and assessed a really big need, similar to what everyone else is facing in this, well, a lot of other people in the state are facing because of this economic downturn. Organizations such as Scholarship Junkies and the Washington Dream Coalition and many others came together to create on their own a COVID-19 relief fund that is funded by private donations. Organizing partners on this fund have raised millions of dollars in private donations, and people are volunteering their time to help process applicants and get money out to people as quickly as possible. But they already have a wait list because there's just such an immense need. I'll lift up that this community organizing effort is really an example of centering community expertise and community care. But I'll also say there needs to be a state investment to meet a level of need. The disaster cash assistance program that Liz talked about is an example of actually kind of bad policy because the application itself is cumbersome. There's so many hoops that people have to jump through to be able to even get approved, and the application is set up in a way that puts families at risk of public charge. That's why at the start of this pandemic, it feels like years ago, but back in April, more than 430 organizations came together and signed a letter to Governor Inslee asking for a $100 million commitment from the state for a publicly funded but community administered fund. The Budget and Policy Center signed on, and we've been supporting this effort, but I want to lift up that we are not the ones leading it. It is really the amazing organizing work of other partners like the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, Entre Hermanos, One America, Fair Work Center, Washington Dream Coalition, and so many other organizations that are leading this work. I'll also lift up that it's organizing from people in the community that has, I think, helped secure a soft commitment from Governor Inslee to put some money into this fund. So for example, it's been people being on the phone with the governor and really sharing their stories. For example, one man sharing his story of working in a Tyson meat packing plant and still going to work even though there were unsafe working conditions. This man eventually, because of the unsafe working conditions, became infected with COVID-19 and brought it back to his family, and just trying to create a living for himself and his family. Washington State, with all of the wealth that we have, should not be a place where people have to make choices like this. It's just not okay. And we shouldn't have to be proving, people in the community shouldn't have to be proving their deservingness to have access to these funds. We also know that we will need some continued pressure on the governor's office to make sure that this soft commitment into the fund really meets the needs of the community, and that $100 million or more is there so that everybody who is in need of cash assistance right now can access it. We also know that in the long term, a one-time emergency assistance payment is not going to be enough. So that's why over the long term, advocates have come together to also organize around a permanent unemployment insurance system that would be available to people who are undocumented. So there will be advocacy on that going into the 2021 legislative session. I'll just end by saying that, Washington state leaders like to say that we put equity at the forefront, that this is a place that is really progressive and what have you. With this fund and with all of the policies that we've talked about today, this is really an opportunity to put our money where our mouths are and actually invest in communities that have either been ignored or targeted for disinvestment, or worse, right, where investments have actually actively harmed communities, like in the case of prisons and policing infrastructure. I'll also say that this is just a start, right? As we look ahead, I think it is possible to imagine Washington as a place where people can have their needs met and have a guaranteed income, where they can thrive, where people can really share their talents because they have what they need. But it's going to take a robust network of different policies and strategies, as Emily said, working together on a continuum to make sure that everybody has what they need. So with that, I'm going to end and turn it back over to Emily, who is going to set us up for the question and answer period. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Very, very well put. And I want to say thank you to Mia, Margaret, and Liz for this conversation. I know that all of us have been really eager to share this information with you and have this conversation. And I want to say that we're most eager to hear from you. And before we dive into the Q&A section, I do want to lift up and create space for some of the partners that have joined us today. And at this time, if you are a community partner, have worked with us on any of our coalitions, feel free to use the chat box to connect with the panelists, or use the raise your hand feature. And we're happy to take you off mute if you want to share any words. So I'm going to pause here and create that space really quickly. And I'm not seeing anything come through, and that's okay. On this note then, if there are folks who still want to share anything, feel free to do so, but we do have some questions that have come in. And we'll go ahead and start with one for Mia. Mia, if you're ready, are there any examples that you're seeing in California or across the country of where policymakers are responding to the current moment with policies rooted in love?
I mean, I'm reluctant to assume that that's why people are, I think that when COVID first started and we actually saw at the federal level, people talking about, like Republicans talking about guaranteed income, which if you had asked me, just a couple months before, if I thought that was a possibility, I would have thought that was bananas. But I think that there is a way in which, if I'm being generous, that I think that underneath that is, if it's not a recognition that people who policymakers feel more personally aligned with are being harmed by, the existing kind of economic infrastructure, then yes, I would say that that's what that's about. Explicitly, I think I see it a little bit more in some of the experiments that have happened around, some of the pilots that are happening around cash in the country. There's an incredible pilot happening in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, called Magnolia's Mother's Trust, which is part of a project run by this woman, Aisha Nyandoro, who, full disclosure, is a friend of mine. And she is doing a guaranteed income pilot with low-income single moms who are all Black. And part of what is so powerful about that work is, she's like, Aisha was born and raised in Jackson. Her grandmother was in Jackson. Her mother was in Jackson. So she's like many generations of Black women growing up in Jackson. And part of her commitment to the work she's doing now is like a deep love for her hometown and for the Black women who she sees struggling unnecessarily to be able to, kind of have their families do well. And I think she also recognizes, though, that when you are focused on supporting people who live at the intersection of racism and classism and sexism, that when you demonstrate what it looks like to make those folks okay, and you demonstrate like what policy looks like to support poor Black women, you are also demonstrating what policy looks like for the rest of us. Policy that counters sexism and racism and classism is going to ultimately support everyone in America. So I feel like there is like a deep thread of love that goes from the work that Aisha does for Black women to recognizing like our collective well-being and vitality.
Thank you so much, Mia. We had one other question come through in line with just your work around guaranteed income, and if you could share anything more about that.
I mean, part of so just to give some context to it, I spent a year talking to low and no income people across the country about guaranteed income. So partly just like introducing the idea, but then really wanting to correct what I saw as a mistake that was being made in the conversation, which was that nobody was talking to poor people about guaranteed income. And we often make policies and create programs and solutions without actually not just talking to, but following the leadership of the people who would actually are meant to benefit from whatever it is we're creating. So I wanted to make an effort to correct for that. And as I said earlier, like when you talk to people about money, like there's this very practical thing that money does in our lives. And if you don't have to worry about it, I think we're less conscious of it. But it does more than just simply buy us the things that we need. It really, in the context of American capitalism, it creates a kind of like agency and ability to believe in possibility for yourself that is very hard to hold if you do not have, if you're having to make stupid decisions, not stupid because of you, but stupid because of our systems, between things, keeping your gas on, right? Like keeping your heat on in the winter and paying your rent. The folks that I talk to, when I talk to them about their dreams, which they like could easily imagine, so much of what it was things like, people want to like create home for themselves and their families. They want to not have to tell, this one woman told me this story about her child, like unbeknownst to her, tried out for and was like, and made like the cheerleading squad. And she was panicking about, like on the one hand, she was super excited that her kid had done this amazing thing. But on the other hand, she was panicking about like being able to afford the uniform. And that's just like, if you're solidly middle class, that's not a thing you have to worry about. Like, you're just going to be able to focus on this amazing thing that your kid did, not also be trying to figure out what you're going to have to cut in order to make sure that they can like show up for their own dreams and kind of enjoyment. So I think largely we don't recognize like how much not having to worry about money unlocks for people, and that we put in place, we think we're tending to people's needs by creating food stamps and public housing, when we're really just kind of creating additional barriers for people to have to jump through. And that's not to say that, like, I'm not trying to say that we need to get rid of the safety net system, because that's not what it is, but we need to have an approach to supporting like economic security that is, one, just gives people the resources they need, which is money, but also approaches things like education and housing and food with an assumption of trust, with like the assumption that we're dealing with grown-ass people, and those people know what it is they need and can make decisions for themselves and their families. And we don't need to be monitoring folks and creating all kinds of hoops for them to jump through and having like work requirements and things like that.
Thanks, Mia. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit to Washington State specific, unless there's other questions that come through specifically for Mia. One of the questions that came through is, since there will be issues with the Washington State budget for the next 3 years and the foreseeable future, how does that change at all the arguments for the importance of cash assistance? And this could be for Margaret or Liz.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Again, about what do we do now that we have this $8.8 billion budget or revenue shortfall over the next 3 years? And it's an important question, right? We can't deny that reality. And also we need to remember that Washington State has a lot of potentially really progressive revenue tools that we're not using and we could be using to help fill those gaps. The first thing state leaders should consider is just drawing from our state's rainy day fund. We have a budget stabilization account full of billions of dollars to use in situations like this. Like, this is the time to use money from that fund. At the same time, we have some policy levers that could bring on some revenue fairly quickly. So things like increasing rates on high value real estate and estate tax. We shouldn't really be considering measures like that are regressive, so like increases in the sales tax. because that could actually harm people with low incomes or people with no incomes even further. In the long term, we can consider or not even in the long term, but we should pass them now because it'll take a little while to get them up and running. But things like a capital gains tax, right, which we've been advocating for as a community for years now, and policymakers don't have on the books. And if we had that money on the books, it would have been $1 billion per year in additional funds to really respond to this crisis. And so this excuse that, yes, Washington State is facing a revenue crisis, that's true given the structure that we have now, but we have the potential to really change our tax structure to make it more progressive, to ensure that people who are doing okay right now and living in excess are actually paying back into the system and ensuring communities have what they need to get by.
Great. The next question is, what do you think about some of these policies getting passed in the context of COVID-19, and what as an advocate can we do to make this a reality? I think Liz, I'm gonna pick on you.
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question, and one that our team is thinking really deeply about and would love to strategize with as many other folks as we can to think about how we move this work forward. You know, I think what Margaret was just pointing to around revenue is going to be a really crucial thing for us to think about, right? Is how do we push back against the narrative that austerity is our only option, right? That we have to cut rather than make the investments that our communities need to not just stabilize programs like Tanf that are already on the books, but to actually like create new systems that really more adequately meet community needs. And I think, you know, a critical part of that is listening to folks who are most affected and supporting folks to tell their stories. So I think, you know, that's what we're thinking about as the Budget and Policy Center is like, how do we leverage our positionality to do that and to really communicate that like in this moment of like economic disaster for folks, like we have a real opportunity to pursue transformative changes in this moment, to not just get us back to where we used to be, but to build something that's better. And that's going to take like real collective effort. So I don't necessarily have anything that's like super revelatory or a silver bullet on this, but I think look forward to working deeply with folks on this call to think through what the strategies are.
Thank you, Liz. This question is a little bit in line with universal basic income. And so this could be answered by Margaret, Liz, or if Mia, you have any thoughts. How do all of the values that Mia laid out and the state level policies that Liz, Emily, and Margaret discussed connect to the push for universal basic income?
I mean, like I am a huge fan of the idea of UBI. Largely just because it is so straightforward. It's not like, let's use money to create like this other thing and then kind of get people what they need. It really both trusts people and kind of supports people's self-determination and agency, but it's also effective, right? We actually have like 40 years of research that let us know that guaranteed income, like on all of the things that like we care about, right? Whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it's savings, whether it's economic security, like all the things that we kind of care about in terms of how like people are doing well, guaranteed income helps. The big worry that I think some folks have around guaranteed income is that is going to decrease, people are going to work less. Which like to one, I say like, that would be awesome if people worked less, because why do we think that it's so great to like spend 50 years working 8 hours a day, like all the time? That sounds awful to me. So like great if people work less, but actually that doesn't happen. What it does is it allows people to just like move forward faster. So I think that, all of those things like firmly point toward guaranteed income. And I think we have to be careful about thinking about like, it does matter how it's constructed. It does matter how we think about what it looks like. There are some approaches that are like, let's eliminate the safety net system and replace that with guaranteed income, which I say no to. And the other approaches are like, let's tax wealthy people what they actually owe us. And like, we're basically redistributing money to the people who are actually working to create wealth for the country to make sure that they're okay. There's an argument to be made for pre-distribution, which is like, don't take the money from them in the first place and pay people like $50 an hour. But I think that I'm not a policy person or like a tax person. So I think that there are pros and cons to all of that. But largely, I think what we need to be doing is like fairly simple. And that is just like giving people money. And we have it. It's not like we don't have it.
The next question, reparations for African Americans is a strategy that many are talking about. It's also a cash policy. What are your thoughts on this, especially since it's a race targeted strategy versus cash assistance as universal strategy?
Yes. I think it's both and. I don't think we actually should be talking about one thing or another. One of the things that has come up for, as I've as I started to do this work around guaranteed income, I became like one of, a handful of Black people who talks about guaranteed income. So I've been talking to lots of audiences about this idea. And one of the things that comes up continually is we seem to think that we need to choose between various strategies. To which I say, like, who told us we needed to do that? Why would we need to choose between reparations and guaranteed income? Why would we need to choose between like fully funding public schools and having universal healthcare and guaranteed income and reparations? We actually can do all of these things. And I think that part of what we need to do is get out of the mindset that we are going to need to ask permission of someone else who we're going to have to convince that these things are a good idea. And I'm not saying that like, if you're a lawmaker, you don't have people that you have to like work with and compromise around. But I think when we compromise, we end up not actually figuring out what's truly possible. And we undercut the potential for all of the like brilliant and righteous ideas that we have by deciding that like people are not going to be okay with them. So I actually think like, let's have all the things. Like we can actually do that.
That's a great reminder. Let's have all the things. I love it. So there's one final question, and we're reaching towards the end of our hour. And this is more for Washington. So I'm going to actually ask Margaret to answer this question. So this is about whether we're actually talking with people who are experiencing poverty and who are those most affected by the crisis. And what are your thoughts on for Washington State reaching out to and talking with these with individuals who are experiencing poverty and having that influence policy making?
Thank you so much for this question. This is, I think, like central to policy making, right? As Liz acknowledged, I think organizationally we need to do a better job actually doing this in our work. I'll acknowledge that, yeah, like my family grew up poor, we grew up low income, but my financial situation has changed and I'm no longer really experiencing the same levels of stress that my mom had to experience growing up, right? Like I will not be raising kids if I choose to have kids in the same way that my mom had to and make those really hard choices. So I'll acknowledge that, yeah, Washington, we as a center need to do better. We largely rely on our partners who actually work directly in community to really hear those stories, to hear policy recommendations, but I'd really like to move forward in doing better. The other thing that gives me hope is the fact that we are seeing more and more people running for office who are from directly impacted communities and have those connections. And that makes me think that maybe we can get to a day where, Emily and I are in a meeting on the working families tax credit, and we say that the average amount that a person will get from that credit is $350. And we hear, we agree it's not enough money, but we hear lawmakers say, well, we shouldn't pass the policy because it doesn't sound like a lot of money, when in fact $350 could really be the difference between someone having a car to be able to take themselves to an appointment or to work, or not having their car fixed to do that, or the difference between being able to pay rent for a month and not being evicted. So we know the value of these small payments. We agree they need to be bigger, but when we're talking to policymakers, like it's just not translating, which is why I think, everybody on this call, everybody who's listening has the power to reach out to lawmakers and share those stories. And it really takes everybody incessantly and constantly reaching out and sharing and really convince. And we shouldn't have to, right? We shouldn't have to convince lawmakers and people in power, but it's just what it's going to take. yeah, I'll totally acknowledge we ourselves can be better.
Thank you, Margaret, for that. And that concludes all of the questions that we've gotten so far. I don't think I've missed any. I hope I didn't. And I just want to, again, really quickly thank all of the panelists. Mia, thank you so, so much for being here. You just shared so much knowledge and so much important critical grounding in this work, and we couldn't do this without you. And I just wanted to, on one last note, share with you that we'll be following up with all of the attendees of the meeting via email to share both the recording of this as well as actions that you can take to continue this advocacy on each of these policies and stay engaged in this work. And just like Margaret just said, it's going to take this constant pressure to make these policies a reality. And so just thank you all for joining us. Please stay in touch with us, and we'll see you again soon.